Some stories are so brutal, so steeped in legend, that they echo for 1,000 years. They become more than just the end of a person's life. They become a symbol of an age, a turning point that unleashes forces of unimaginable destruction. This is one of those stories. It's about a king, a kingdom, and an execution so horrific it's been debated for centuries. Imagine a king, defeated and captured, pinned down in the mud of his own capital. A knife, cold and sharp, carves the shape of a great eagle into his back. His ribs are then broken one by one, wrenched from his spine and pulled outwards to form a pair of bloody twisted wings. And finally, as an act of ultimate contempt, his lungs are pulled from his chest and draped over his shoulders, fluttering with his last agonized breaths. It sounds like something from a nightmare, but according to Norse legend, this was the real fate of an English king. This is the tale of the Blood Eagle and its victim, King Ælla of Northumbria. But did it really happen? And how did a king of one of England's most powerful realms face such a terrifying end at the hands of Viking invaders? The answer is a story of ambition, civil war, and a thirst for revenge that would seal the fate of a kingdom and change the course of English history forever. To understand how King Ælla fell, you first have to picture his world. 9th century England wasn't a single unified country. It was a patchwork of rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, all fighting for the top spot. In the south, Wessex was on the rise. In the Midlands, Mercia held enormous power. And in the north, stretching from the River Humber up to modern-day Scotland, lay the vast, ancient, and deeply troubled kingdom of Northumbria. For centuries, Northumbria had been a center of culture and learning. Its monasteries, like the one at Lindisfarne, produced breathtaking art and scholarship, including masterpieces like the Lindisfarne Gospels. It was home to brilliant minds like the Venerable Bede, whose writings are our main window into this era. But by the middle of the 9th century, that golden age was a distant memory. The kingdom was rotting from the inside. The poison was internal strife. Northumbria was a realm divided against itself, often split between the interests of its two ancestral parts, Bernicia in the north and Deira in the south. Its politics had become a bloody revolving door of assassinations. Between the early 8th and mid-9th centuries, Northumbria went through more than 10 kings, with the average reign lasting just 6.5 years. Most were murdered or violently overthrown. This wasn't a stable kingdom. It was a state on the verge of collapse. Into this chaos stepped a man named Ælla. Frustratingly, we know very little about his life, and his origins are debated by historians. But the sources that do exist aren't kind. They often describe him as a tyrant and a usurper, a man who seized power through sheer force. Around the year 865, he violently overthrew the sitting king, Osbert, and took the throne for himself. This act didn't just swap one king for another, it plunged Northumbria into open civil war. Osbert was kicked out, but he wasn't gone for good. He still had supporters, an army, and a claim to the throne, leaving Northumbria fatally fractured just as the greatest storm in its history was about to break. And while Northumbria was busy tearing itself apart, an external threat had been growing for decades. Ever since 793, when Viking longships appeared and sacked the holy monastery of Lindisfarne, the shores of England had known the terror of the Norsemen. For years, these were just hit-and-run raids, swift, brutal attacks to plunder towns for gold, silver, and slaves before sailing away. But the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were a rich and tempting prize. The Vikings got more ambitious. The raids became more frequent, more organized. An entire generation grew up under the shadow of the longship. They paid tributes, called Danegeld, to buy temporary peace, but it was never enough. The weakness of the English kingdoms, especially Northumbria, was an open invitation. and in 865 that invitation was accepted. This time, the Vikings weren't coming to raid, they were coming to conquer. To get the Viking side of the story, we have to leave the history books behind and step into the blood and ice world of the Norse sagas. It's here, in epic poems written down centuries later, that we find the legendary reason for the invasion. A story of a father, a snake pit, and a promise of terrible revenge. At the center of this legend is a figure who has become synonymous with the Viking Age, Ragnar Lothbrok. Was Ragnar a real person, a combination of several warriors, or a purely literary invention? Historians still argue about it, but in the sagas he's the ultimate Viking hero, a fearless raider, a king, and a man who supposedly terrorized Europe. According to the tale of Ragnar's sons, Ragnar got cocky and decided to invade Northumbria with just 2 ships, thinking his fame alone would be enough. The sagas say a storm wrecked his small fleet on the coast, leaving him stranded. King Ælla, seizing the opportunity, gathered his army and crushed the legendary Viking. Ragnar and his men were captured. Now Ælla had a choice. He could have given Ragnar a warrior's death, a quick end by the sword, but as the legend goes, he chose something far more cruel. He ordered Ragnar Lothbrok to be thrown into a deep pit filled with venomous snakes. As the vipers struck, the dying Ragnar didn't beg for mercy. Instead, he made a chilling prophecy, a final taunt to his killer. He's said to have roared, "How the little pigs will grunt when they hear how the old boar has suffered." The old boar was Ragnar. The little pigs were his sons, Ivar the Boneless, Björn Ironside, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Ubba. This wasn't just a cry of pain. It was a promise that his death would be avenged. When news of their father's agonizing death reached his sons, their grief turned into cold fury. The sagas paint a vivid picture. They were no longer just raiders seeking treasure. They were now executioners with a single purpose. They assembled the largest coalition of Viking warriors ever seen. From all over the Scandinavian world, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, warbands gathered. English writers, seeing this massive force, gave it a name that spoke to their terror. The Mysil heathen here, the Great Heathen Army. In the autumn of 865, this army landed in East Anglia. They were led, the sagas say, by the sons of Ragnar, with the brilliant and mysterious Ivar the Boneless in command. Unlike previous Viking forces, they didn't just raid and leave, they made camp. The local East Anglians, terrified, quickly made a deal, giving the army horses and supplies. This was a huge strategic win for the Vikings. They were no longer just a coastal threat. They were a mobile land army, ready to strike at the heart of any kingdom. After wintering and building their strength, they turned their eyes north. Their destination? York, the capital of Northumbria. Their target? The man who had killed their father. Their target was King Ælla. But here's the thing. That's the legend. It's a fantastic story that's fueled TV shows and epics for centuries. The contemporary English sources, though, like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, tell a different story. They mention the army, the invasion, and the fall of York. But on Ragnar Lothbrok and his snake pit, complete silence. For the English, the motive wasn't personal revenge. It was something far simpler and just as terrifying: conquest. In 866, the Great Heathen Army, now mounted on East Anglian horses, marched north. Their organization was unlike anything the Anglo-Saxons had ever seen. This wasn't a mob. It was a coordinated army with a clear goal. Their target was Eoforwick, the Northumbrian capital we now call York. As we know, Northumbria was in no shape to fight back. The kingdom was paralyzed by the civil war between Ælla and the king he'd overthrown, Osbert. This division proved fatal. As the Viking army swept in, they faced almost no opposition. On November 1st, 866, the Great Heathen Army stormed and captured York with shocking ease. The heart of Northumbrian power was now in their hands. Losing their capital was the wake-up call the feuding Northumbrians needed. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that, faced with a common enemy, Ælla and Osbert finally did the unthinkable. They called a truce. They combined their forces, rallied what was left of their armies, and prepared a desperate counterattack. On March 21st, 867, the united Northumbrian army arrived at the walls of York. The battle that followed was a brutal, chaotic fight inside the city itself. The Northumbrians, desperate to kick the invaders out, attacked with everything they had. According to one chronicler, they actually managed to breach the city's defenses and pour into the streets. For a moment, it might have looked like they had the upper hand, but it was a trap. The narrow, winding streets of the city canceled out any advantage the Northumbrians might have had in numbers. This was the kind of close-quarters fighting where battle-hardened Vikings thrived. The Anglo-Saxon attack bogged down into a desperate street-by-street brawl. The Vikings, who may have faked a retreat to lure them in, had them right where they wanted them. The result was a total disaster for the Northumbrians. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is short and brutal in its summary. A great slaughter was made, and both the kings were slain on the spot. King Ælla and his rival Osbert, united only in their final doomed battle, died fighting in the streets of York. The Northumbrian army was annihilated. With their leadership gone, the few survivors had no choice but to make peace. With that one battle, the independent kingdom of Northumbria was finished. The Vikings were the new masters of the north. They installed a puppet king, an Englishman named Ecgbert, to rule for them and collect taxes to fund their next campaign. Northumbria had fallen, but for King Ælla, the story the Vikings told was far from over. His death on the battlefield wasn't enough to satisfy the hunger for revenge that had, according to legend, brought them there. For Ælla, a second, far more terrible death awaited in the realm of myth. And this is where the story splits in two. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, our most reliable source, is clear. King Ælla died in battle at York. It was a warrior's end, however catastrophic for his kingdom. But that straightforward account isn't the one that has echoed through time. The Norse sagas, especially the tale of Ragnar's sons, offer a profoundly different and infinitely more gruesome fate for the man they blamed for Ragnar's death. In the saga version, Ælla wasn't killed in the heat of battle. He was captured alive by Ivar the Boneless and his brothers. They had their father's killer at their mercy, and they weren't going to give him a quick death. They had something else planned, a ritual reserved for the most hated enemies, designed as the ultimate expression of dominance, the Blood Eagle. The descriptions are the stuff of nightmares. The victim was held down, face first. The executioner then used a blade to carve the outline of an eagle with spread wings into their back. The next step was the most horrific. The ribs were hacked away from the spine and then bent outwards, creating a pair of wings from the man's own ribcage. The final, unimaginable act was to pull the victim's lungs out through the opening in their back and lay them on the splayed ribs. The sagas claim the victim was kept alive through most of this, and that the fluttering of the exposed lungs resembled the flapping of wings. This, according to the legends, is what Ivar the Boneless did to King Ælla. It was the ultimate revenge, a ritualistic slaughter that didn't just end a life, but desecrated a body, turning a king into a monstrous trophy. Some sources even suggest it was a sacrifice to the Viking god Odin. This image of Ælla's end has become one of the most enduring symbols of Viking savagery. But did it actually happen? This is one of the great debates of the Viking Age. For a long time, most historians were highly skeptical. The main argument against it is the lack of any contemporary evidence. The Anglo-Saxon sources never mention it. The first descriptions of the blood eagle only show up in poems and sagas written hundreds of years after Ælla's death. The scholar Roberta Frank famously argued that the whole idea was a Christian myth, born from later writers misunderstanding complex Norse poetry. She suggested that a poetic phrase describing a warrior falling face down on the battlefield, his back torn by eagles, could have been taken literally over time and embellished into a gruesome ritual. The story just got more horrifying with each retelling. However, the debate isn't completely closed. A 2021 study looked at the question from a medical perspective and concluded that, anatomically, the ritual was brutally possible. Using modern knowledge and assessing Viking-era weapons, researchers determined that it could have been performed, though the victim would have died from shock and blood loss very early on. They also argue that while it's extreme, this kind of symbolic violence wasn't entirely out of place in a society that sometimes used it to display power and avenge insults to a family's honor. So, what was the real fate of King Ælla? The overwhelming historical evidence points to a death in battle on March 21st, 867. The blood eagle, in all its stomach-churning detail, almost certainly belongs to the realm of legend. But the power of that legend is undeniable. Fact or fiction, the story of the blood eagle served a purpose. It transformed Ælla from a defeated king into the ultimate victim of Viking wrath. It cemented the reputation of Ragnar's sons as merciless avengers and sent a chilling message to anyone who dared cross them. The story of Ælla's death became a weapon in its own right, a tale of terror that helped fuel the Viking conquest of England. Whether he died by the sword or the mythical eagle, King Ælla's death was a massive turning point. It marked the end of the independent kingdom of Northumbria. The Viking victory at York wasn't just a military win, it created a new political reality. The Great Heathen Army didn't stop there. They pushed south, conquering East Anglia and much of Mercia, carving out a huge part of England that would become known as the Danelaw. For the next century, England would be a divided nation, with Viking kings ruling the north and east. What began as a campaign of revenge, at least in legend, became a full-blown war of conquest. Ælla's death was the catalyst that shattered Anglo-Saxon power in the north and opened the floodgates for a new era of Viking rule. The conflict would eventually find its hero in Alfred the Great of Wessex, who would finally halt the Viking tide and lay the groundwork for a unified England. But that's another story. The tale of Ælla forces us to look at that murky line where history becomes myth. The man himself was likely a ruthless usurper ruling a kingdom already in decline. His historical death was violent, but not unusual for the time. Yet, legend turned him into something more. He became the central victim in a grand drama of vengeance, his fate sealed not by politics, but by a hero in a pit of snakes. The story of the Blood Eagle, real or imagined, reveals a deep truth about the Viking Age. Stories were as powerful as swords. It shows how memory can be shaped and twisted to serve a narrative of power and terror. And it leaves us with one last chilling question. In the end, which is more powerful, the way a person really dies, or the way we remember them? If you found this dive into the brutal history of the Viking Age compelling, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories from the darkest and most fascinating corners of the past. So, what do you think? Was the Blood Eagle a real practice or a masterpiece of Viking propaganda? Let us know in the comments. And check out our other video on Alfred the Great to see how the Anglo-Saxons finally fought back. Thanks for watching.